Triangle is a movie that few people know about, and fewer have seen. Trailers also don't really work in its favor either, hence why I'm likely mostly going to be using stills while talking about this for the intro, because spoilers crop up fast. Like Movie Bob, I'm going to talk as much as I can before getting into the finer details of the movie, but like I said, it's hard to talk about, but I'll give you guys a heads up. For those who have already seen the movie, you can skip ahead to get to the discussion of the movie proper. Basic setup is that a group is taking a boat out for a leisurely sail across the waves. For the record, Triangle is just the name of the boat. As far as I know, this movie doesn't have anything to do with the Bermuda Triangle. The winds die down in seconds, a storm rolls in, an ominous message is heard on the radio when calling to the Coast Guard. The storm worsens, one gets separated from the group, and the boat gets capsized. After the storm subsides, the group is trapped in the ocean until a massive cruise ship named the Aeolus appears out of nowhere. The group makes their presence known as a figure on the bow of the ship retreats, and they make their way up to the ship proper. Hoping that the one separated from the group might have been picked up by the ship earlier on, the group hopes to find her as well as the ship's crew. However, despite the massive size of the ship, there doesn't seem to be anyone anywhere. However, it soon becomes painfully clear that they aren't the only ones on the ship. Eventually, the one and only goal becomes getting the hell off the ship and getting back home. And that's pretty much all it's safe to say about the movie without giving things away. Horror isn't a genre I'm intimately familiar with, and what's more, there's really only one or two very specific genres and aesthetics that would actually scare me, so I can't really weigh in on the fear factor aspect. One thing I can say about Triangle is that it pulls off what is apparently a nigh impossible feat, in that it's a horror movie that does not have jump scares, be they visual and or auditory. The only other movies in the genre that I can think of that go this route are Get Out and Hereditary, and the latter both sucked and still had one jump scare. Broadly speaking, it's a psychological horror thriller story where violence comes into play in certain situations rather than being exclusively about psychological tension and character drama, though that's in no short supply. It's not a gore fest or an over-the-top apocalypse harbinger either. The only thing left at this point would be to check out the links to the trailers that I have in the description. But do so knowing that they will spoil one of the major elements of the story. It comes up about a third of the way into the movie, but even so, it's best experienced, not spoiled beforehand. But if that's what it takes for you to check it out before I continue on ahead, go ahead. Lastly, I recommend watching the cast and crew interviews video, and maybe watching it a second time, given what you learn by the end. Don't even look at the scene selection menu either, because if you're called away and come back, the titles could spoil things for you too. This is officially the point of no return when it comes to spoilers, so if you're still not convinced, even after having watching the trailers, well, then I guess it's time to move forward. Once on board the ship, a masked killer ends up appearing, and ends up killing everyone other than the protagonist, Jess. The killer falls overboard, and Jess makes the baffling discovery that everyone on the capsized boat, including herself, has reappeared and has begun boarding the ship, and the idea of loops is first conveyed to the audience. She realizes that the masked killer was in fact herself, and told her that if they board, she needs to kill them all. Jess instead seeks to change the way the events unfold so that, hopefully, they can all find a way to get off the ship together. However, in the end, another killer version of herself crops up and murders the last of the boardees. Upon the death of the last of them, Jess witnesses yet another version of herself, who bludgeons yet another version of herself, before seeing the capsized boat return again. It's at this point that the protagonist realizes that the boat will only ever come back if all of them are dead. So she dons a coat, a makeshift mask, and gears up. But rather than trying to use the arrival strictly as a means of escape, Jess seeks to kill everyone, but then rush over and stop them from ever getting on the ship in the first place and breaking the cycle once and for all. However, at this point, the circumstances have aligned in a way where she becomes the very killer that she faced initially, and despite her foreknowledge, ends up being thwarted and going overboard. This is your absolute last chance not to be spoiled about things that not even the trailers managed to ruin beforehand, by the way. Miraculously awakening on the shore with the coat of the ship tumbling in the tide, she sets her sights on getting back home and reuniting with her son. She makes it back and sees her son, but to her horror, she realizes that all she's done is revert back to the very beginning of the movie, and that, like with the ship, there's another version of herself here. Jess reels from the shock as she listens to herself physically and verbally abuse her son, with the audience realizing that the careful edits in the early part of the film masked this side of her from us. I.e., this is not some evil doppelganger version of Jess. This is Jess. The Jess from the boat can't stand herself and wants her life back, so she uses the act of ringing the doorbell as a distraction, makes her way to the garden shed, retrieves a hammer, and bludgeons herself to death, to the horror and confusion of her son, who, unbeknownst to her, witnessed the event. Jess tries to convince her son that he was just having a nightmare, and brings him to the car, stashing her alternate self in the trunk. Along the way, a seagull smacks into the car windshield, but when Jess goes to get the body and take it out of sight to try and calm her son, she sees a pile of dozens of gulls where she goes to toss the bird, signifying that even now, she still hasn't escaped. In the end, the two of them end up in a terrible car accident with a semi-truck that twists the car to the point where her son is dead. At this point, the camera turns to Jess and a seemingly random taxi driver. She asks to go to the harbor, meets up with the group from the beginning, and sets off to start the journey once again. Questions of who, what, when, where, how, and why regarding the horror are all valid in some capacity, even after having seen it. Now, it's not like Shadow of the Colossus where you get next to no information and you're no better off at the end than you were at the beginning. The premise is clear, and more can be learned by watching a second time, looking at the cast and crew interviews video, etc. The mystery lies in certain details, ones that I hope to uncover. Or if nothing else, offer my thoughts on. Obviously, we're dealing with a supernatural premise, so the question regarding what's supposed to be the rules is more open to interpretation than usual. But let's just dive into the potential answers and symbolism found throughout the movie. The question first and foremost is why? Why does all of this happen? And what is the purpose of it all? To answer that, first thing to understand is the sort of subgenre that this movie occupies, that I have to call Sisyphean torture, by virtue of the fact that while it's a bit of a misnomer, I actually can't really think of a more apt shorthand. It involves subjecting a character to a harrowing and or hellish scenario that inflicts moral and or psychological damage. But where it deviates from the myth of Sisyphus is that at the end, the character awakens with no memory of what has transpired, so they can experience all the horror anew and in the same way. I'm not deep into the horror genre, so I don't actually know how many times this narrative element has appeared in a horror story. In fact, the only times I recall it ever appearing in any media I know of was in the Amnesia custom story A Coward's Debt, the film adaptation of Stephen King's Room 1408, kind of, Undertale / the Dusk Tale fan-made game, again, kind of, and Saints Row 4, believe it or not.
Ready to kick you in the nuts on your fancy new gaming system with literally hundreds of thousands of extra pixels. Count them and see. Or wait till someone on the internet does it for you. Look at all this dick kicking. Look!
This is relevant because the characters themselves recount the myth of Sisyphus while on board the ship. This is because Aeolus, the cruise ship, was the name of the father of Sisyphus in Greek mythology. Another thing referenced is the fact that Aelus was the god of wind. This is a significant detail because the whole reason the group found their way on the ship in the first place is because the winds carrying their sails died down in seconds. Also, while the ocean was calm when they first set out, a violent storm's winds generated waves that ended up capsizing their boat. As if that weren't enough, the theater on board the Aelus has a massive backdrop depicting what appears to be a face composed of clouds blowing strong winds into a ship in a storm. All of this suggests that the ship actively trapped the group here, and that there is a purpose to their being here. The basic premise of Sisyphus's torment is, if you haven't watched the movie, that he was condemned to constantly push a rock up a hill, only to watch it fall back down at the end. That's pretty much all there is to it. But the punishment of Sisyphus is reflected in Jess's trials on board the ship, experiencing continuous loops that she tries to escape from and ultimately ends up right back at the beginning of again. Now, apparently, the condemnation was brought about in Sisyphus's case as a result of cheating death, or rather, he made a promise to death that he didn't keep. This feeds into the theory that the taxi driver seen near the end of the movie is a sort of personification of death. And this is made patently clear by the color scheme and music becoming much darker when the camera turns to face him and Jess after the car accident. The theory is that Jess died at some point, and answering the question of where, this is her own personal hell, following her making some kind of promise to death and failing to keep it. This is again reinforced by the film itself when the taxi driver says that he'll leave the meter running and asks her, "You will come back, won't you?" And Jess explicitly states, "Yeah, I promise." However, it's worth noting that this is what would transpire after she had been on the ship. So her memories and state of mind are much different from what they would have been before any and all of this had transpired. Therefore, from my perspective, there's more to be deduced, but that will come later. The other burning questions primarily concern who. Who is the killer? This at first is obvious. It's Jess. But which Jess? Where are the others on board the ship? How many are there? What changes do they go through? How do their actions affect the others? And when do they do what they do? Another YouTuber by the name of Pen Yang made his own analysis of what transpires, and I'll create a link that you can click to check it out. As for my own personal interpretation, there appear to be 3 Jesses at any given time, but only 2 distinct versions going down 2 distinct paths. This next part will likely be especially hard to follow if you haven't watched the movie recently, but here goes. From what I saw, any given Jess goes through 3 stages. In stage 1, they arrive on the ship with no preconceptions, they try to explore the ship, their friends get killed by their future selves, and eventually face off against themselves. In stage 2, following the confrontation, they witness another group arrive and come to the realization that something is very wrong, and they need to get off the ship. To do this, they try to disrupt events and alter the way things eventually play out. They injure a member of the group, Victor, lose their locket, find the crew coats and armory. Finally, in stage 3, their efforts to change things and save the group fails. The Jess in question sees the group die a second time at the hands of a different version of herself, having a final confrontation. In the end, all the evidence points to Jess having to become the killer if there is to be any hope of getting off the ship, so she does just that. So, going from the very start of the loops to the end, this is the events chronology as I see them. The first thing that happens is that Jess 1, protagonist Jess in stage 1, gets ready to get on board the ship. She then looks up to a Jess on the ship experiencing the beginning of stage 2 when she confronted herself after the death of the group. However, this is not the protagonist in the future, as I will explain later. This is Other Jess 2. Other Jess, currently in stage 2. And she's on a similar but nonetheless different path. Once on board the ship, Other Jess 2 is reeling from what she's just seen and ends up dropping her keys, which protagonist Jess 1 picks up. Eventually, the group meets up at the theater, and the masked killer ends up shooting at them, which is protagonist Jess 3, the future version of protagonist Jess 1, that is currently in Stage 3 and was already on the ship prior to being boarded by protagonist Jess 1. The two confront one another, and protagonist Jess 3 is sent overboard. This event triggers the arrival of a new group, causing protagonist Jess 1 to enter Stage 2 of her transformation process. This, I believe, is the point where Other Jess 2, who isn't seen by us, witnesses said group returning after dying a second time and enters Stage 3, and gets ready to become the killer while the unassuming group boards the ship with Other Jess 1, the past version of Other Jess 2. Now, how do we know that this is a different Jess and not just the protagonist version of the character? Simple. Just look at the first scene versus the second. Protagonist Jess 1 looks at the group from the other side of the ship. Therefore, there's still more that has to happen before she comes onto the ship and faces herself. Protagonist Jess, now in Stage 2, reels from what she's seen transpire, and ends up dropping the keys left by Other Jess 2, which are picked up by Other Jess 1, who will become Other Jess 2 later, who will drop the keys for protagonist Jess 1, etc., etc. Now conscious of the situation after having unintentionally injured the other group's victor, protagonist Jess 2 loses her locket, takes a shotgun, and tries to begin the process of disrupting events to stop the group from dying all over again. To that end, she confronts Other Jess 1 and Victor to stop him from strangling her. However, while all this is happening, keep in mind that Other Jess 3, the one who realized that she needs to kill the group, is still on board the ship and has been gearing up. This is when the shot in the theater rings out and protagonist Jess 2 intervenes, attempting to kill Other Jess 3. Protagonist Jess 2 attempts to retrieve Victor and get off the ship with Downey and Sally, the other members of the group, since Greg, another member of the group, is already dead. But Victor's gone, and Other Jess 3 has already met up with them, Downey and Sally, led them astray to a room, which will be referenced later on, and attacks them both. However, Sally escapes, and protagonist Jess 2 chases after her. While protagonist Jess 2 pursues Sally, this is the point when Other Jess 1 and 3 cross paths off screen. Eventually, Sally succumbs to her wounds, and Other Jess 1 bludgeons Other Jess 3, possibly to death. It's at this point that the protagonist Jess 2 has seen the deaths play out a second time, enters Stage 3, and begins to become the killer version, protagonist Jess 3. At this point, Other Jess 1 witnesses the group arriving with protagonist Jess 1. Other Jess 1 moves on to Stage 2, just as she was referred to at the beginning as Other Jess 2, who then proceeds to reel, lose her keys, etc., etc. In conclusion, there's only ever one group on board the ship at any given time, but always 3 Jesses, all at different stages of their state of mind, goals, and experiences. A Stage 1 Jess making her way onto the ship, a Stage 2 Jess that's different from the other two and is trying to stop everything from happening, and a Stage 3 Jess who is the exact future version of Jess 1 and will lose in the confrontation with Jess 1. And as one advances in stages, the others progress at the same pace. That's my takeaway from things. But there's still a lot more to cover. Such as, why do things end up the same if both Stage 2 Jesses try to change the way events play out? My theory being that because there are 2 versions of Jess going down slightly different paths, they invariably end up setting the stage for the other's scenario. I.e., when protagonist Jess 2 confronts Other Jess 1, she's trying to change the way things play out and succeeds. But because other Jess 1 is in stage 1, that is how events unfolded. That is the pattern for her. And since they're both the same person and end up reaching the same conclusions, when other Jess reaches stage 2, she'll try to change things so that things play out differently, but for Jess 1, it will actually be the way that they originally were for protagonist Jess 1. In other words, as each Jess tries to change the way events unfold for themselves, they only succeed in setting the stage for their other versions to revert things back to the way they were. With regards to the final fates of the protagonist and other Jess, the first thing to take into consideration is that, again, we don't know for certain that the other Jess is outright beaten to death before going overboard. But regardless, we have to remember that all we see of protagonist Jess is her falling overboard and then miraculously waking up on a random beach. Considering the fact that the characters are trapped in a looping sequence of events, being allowed to die after being tossed overboard but still continue the journey isn't exactly the most ridiculous notion to entertain. So, that's the nitty-gritty of how I perceive the events playing out. But there's a couple of other matters that have yet to be addressed. The nature of the original promise, the mystery of the keys, those are some interesting points of discussion. But first, let's talk about seagulls. I'm just messing with you. Now, we get into the really big questions relating to everything that transpires. When it comes to the keys, the best explanation, given the fact that they pass from Jess to Jess, is that the Jess that originally made a promise to death had her keys with her, but in all subsequent versions lost them in the storm. So they ended up passing from person to person. Or they were placed there on the ship originally by the same force controlling Jess's reality. It's very much possible that the Jess that made the promise originally had different experiences to all those that would follow. That her actions could have led her to keeping the keys, but that's honestly not that interesting of a plot element to me. The real burning question concerns the reason for her hellish imprisonment. What did Jess do? Now, examining the scene where the taxi driver first appears with Jess, there are even more reasons to believe that she is dead and the driver is meant to represent death. The first thing to take note of is that Jess isn't injured at all, despite the collision being enough to kill her son. Secondly, even if you disregard the lethality of the crash as it relates to her son, because young children are a bit more vulnerable, keep in mind the nature of the body of herself that was stashed in the trunk of her car. In order for bystanders to think that the body was a passenger, or the driver, the car itself would have to have been wrecked to the point where the trunk came open, the body tore through the bag's fabric / was cut by a twisted piece of the car's metal, and one or more of the doors would have to have been forced open in the wreck as well. The most damning piece of evidence, however, comes in two forms. One is the clock that's referenced by Pen Yang in the aforementioned analysis of the film. Again, link in the description. In it, attention is called to the clock capable of being seen briefly in the scene where Jess goes to hit her son. The time is about an hour before the time that's shown on the ALIS and Jess's watch. It suggests that because the ship seems to be tied to her, that this was the time of her death. The other is the nature of the bystanders themselves. If you'll notice, not a single one of them approaches Jess. Not one. Despite the fact that she would have been seen exiting the vehicle if she had survived. The one and only person that goes to talk to her is the taxi driver. So we can theorize that Jess makes a promise to this so-called taxi driver, but again, what takes place is Jess speaking with knowledge regarding what will happen when she goes to sail on the Triangle boat. This promise, this set of circumstances, would definitely not have happened in the initial encounter, which begs the question, if this innocuous promise is only an echo of what transpired, Then what set all this in motion? Well, it's pretty damn clear to me from my perspective that there are two massive points of focus on this subject. The car accident itself, but most importantly, her relationship with her son. Near the very end of the movie, we find out that Jess is physically and verbally abusive towards her son. And while the precise severity isn't something that's necessarily critical to the understanding of the story, I will touch on that subject later on. The question to be begged is this. Assuming that she did in fact make some kind of promise at death, then how did she break that promise? The big question is, what was the deal? I'll give you 30 minutes to be back with your son, but then you've got to go, and she tried to run off? Or was it more personal? I.e., if you let me go back, I promise to be a better mother to my son. That last one is the difference between breaking some dry contract stipulation and showing your true colors by saying you'll work to benefit someone else's life when you only really care about your own. It seems pretty obvious to me that part of her punishment is being made to suffer, only to return and realize that while she claimed to care about her son, she was too cruel to him when she was around, and that she needed to face who she is underneath. And this, I feel, ties into the question relating to the severity of the abuse. It's clear that she's stressed and that her son tries her patience, but there's a very, very, very important question to be asked regarding their relationship. Is he actually autistic? Keep in mind, the only person Jess actually knows among the group is Greg. Everyone else is a stranger. And even with regards to Greg himself, all he knows is what Jess tells him. It's very much possible that her son's behaviors aren't the result of a neurological condition, but rather what she claims is a neurological condition, to mask the fact that it's actually the result of nigh perpetual abuse. There's also yet another theory that had Jess not gone back and intervened, the two wouldn't have died in the car crash together. That instead, Jess, in a moment of blinding rage and frustration, actually would have killed her son and stuffed his body in the trunk of the car. And that the time on display on the ship and her watch is not her time of death, but the death of her son. Given how determined she is to get back to her son, I think that it's more a matter of a cycle that she goes through day to day. She gets stressed, loses her temper, takes it out on her kid. Then she looks back, feels super guilty, promises to reform, and does better for a little while. Then she becomes a bit more complacent, stops monitoring herself as much, and starts growing frustrated that things don't seem to be getting better. Then she goes right back to the beginning and does something that she ends up regretting, and the cycle repeats itself. She genuinely cares about her son, but doesn't have the patience or resources to take care of him as well as she wishes she could. This also explains why she's willing to go back on the sailing trip. She knows that she's going to have to go through hell just to see her son one more time. But she's willing to do so anyway because she wants to change, to be better. This begs a small question. Is this hell of hers meant to be condemnation because no matter what, she can't change? And the fact that she never gets a chance to try again is meant to demonstrate that this is the cycle she's been going through the entire time? Or is it more a matter of denying her the illusion that she can change? Because it's only in the face of death, or in the case of the looping Jesses, her harrowing experiences on the Aeolus, that she realizes that she needed to change, but that revelation means nothing because she and her son are dead, and no amount of desire to set things right can change the past of who she was and what she did. These all tie into the basic question that Jess ends up asking herself in the middle of stage 2. Who are you? The cracked mirror and the repeating footage of the character Greg saying, "Don't you see this is all just in your mind?" can be interpreted as allusions to the idea that Jess suffers from some form of psychological instability, but personally I think that it's meant to be a red herring for the audience, that there's a split personality thing going on and that it's all in her head. There's still more to be explored with regards to symbolism, possibly relating to other aspects of the story, so I'm going to be digging into that next. Despite being literally the damn title of the movie, having watched it several times, pored over the philosophy of the elements and events that transpire, and trying to keep track of what Jess exists where, when, and why, I still have nothing when it comes to what the significance of triangles and the number 3 are in this movie. I know that it's the name of the ship, and calling the movie a series of harrowing looping scenarios would spoil things even faster than the trailer, while going with Aeolus or Sisyphus would only make the audience focus on the scene that mentions the myth of Sisyphus, thus making the audience connect the dots between the myth and the protagonist's feelings of deja vu faster than they were meant to. But there are still many moments in the film where triangles and the number 3 appears that you get the impression that they're meant to symbolize something. But as for what that something definitively is, I genuinely don't know. To recap, you've got the boat itself, obviously, which itself has triangular sails, a series of triangular refrigerator magnets next to the sticky note Jess has regarding the boating trip, 3 mirror reflections when first entering the room with a message telling Jess and Greg to go to the theater, both of whom end up on the 3rd floor on their way to the bridge. In one of my favorite scenes in the movie, when Jess bumps into a record player, causing it to loop, every time the music goes back to the beginning, a video edit of Jess going back by a second or two and repeating the same movements happens 3 times before the music fades. Jess's son's shirt has a triangle on it, and the movie's poster, cover, whatever, featured triangles on it as well. Speaking of the room mentioned previously, it's seen 4 times, but it's visited by the protagonist version of Jess 3 times. What's more, there's a more interesting connection to the room. Right from the very beginning of the movie, you'll see that Jess's house number is 237, which just so happens to be the exact same number of the room in the Aeolus that both versions of Jess end up visiting. Room 237 is apparently a significant room in the hotel in The Shining as well. Regardless of the circumstances, whether she be actively abusive, or it be the result of the culmination of stress that eventually erupts, or a mental issue, she would have to hide and curb those elements when interacting with others. This is where the mask element comes into play. During the cast and crew interviews, Melissa George, the actress who plays Jess, talks about the abuse aspect as part of the character that the character tries to hide or destroy and is meant to face. Well, while they aren't as numerous as other elements, there are allusions to masks and secrecy in the film too for those that look closely. One comes about a third of the way into the movie after Jess first discovers that events are happening in a loop, when she goes into the ballroom and sees food that was previously fresh and edible being moldy and rotten. It's reasonable to assume that the ship is inexorably tied to her by virtue of the fact that she's the only one of the group that's allowed to live, even when everyone else dies. Therefore, it's possible to interpret this as a representation of her, rather than just being a spooky effect that holds no symbolic purpose and is just there to spook the audience. Which, for the record, worked on me. That she makes it seem like she's a loving mother, but she is, in fact, rotten on the inside. The next comes from a pair of posters, with one advertising a masked ball event. The second poster is much more difficult to see unless you pause. Around the 55-minute mark, there's a poster that I believe reads, Lady Rudkin's Secret. I don't know if this is referencing something real and I just couldn't find it by virtue of reading it incorrectly and thus searched for the wrong thing, or if it was created specifically for the film's set and isn't actually some kind of play or poem or story or whatnot. Regardless, there's also a small paper orange mask on a lampshade in Jess's house that can only be seen after she returns from being on the Aeolus. The mask itself is one of those stereotypical super masks, like those the Incredibles use. Interestingly enough, at first glance, I thought it was a sideways 8, the infinity symbol. The final and most obvious is, of course, the mask she dons when killing off the group, with the most significant line coming during the point where she confronts Greg. When he asks why she doesn't want him to see her face, she says, "Because this is not me." This seems as good a time as any for a subject I want to touch on, which is the nature of the deaths that occur at the hands of the other, bleeding, whatever, Jess from the analysis. This concerns the analysis offered by Pen Yang, who made an interesting observation regarding the behavior of the other Jesses. What's understandably jarring about this other Jess's behavior is that she seems a lot more violent and cold-blooded at heart when it comes to killing the others off. Another version of herself gets beaten, presumably to death, before being tossed overboard. But more significant is the personal and brutal nature in which she dispatches Downey and Sally, stabbing both and being particularly aggressive towards Downey. Another very important factor to take into consideration is the demeanor of other Jess, particularly with regards to how she talks to Downey and Sally both during the first face-to-face confrontation and as she's leading them away to kill them. She faces down the barrel of a gun and not only doesn't flinch, she doesn't even try to lie and reassure them that she didn't kill Victor. My theory regarding the two versions going through essentially the same journey at the same time feels like it's missing something with regards to the other version of Jess. One of my initial thoughts, actually, was that this was a manifestation of, not necessarily her evil self, but one that embraces violence a bit more readily than the protagonist version of the character. The part of herself that she tries to mask, to keep at bay, as it were. However, again, since we never experience all the events from the other Jess's perspectives, we can't really know for certain when and how she got to this point, though there are some things that can be theorized based on what we see. The first thing to take into consideration is the nature of the victims we see getting killed by the other Jess, Downey and Sally. Yes, their deaths are more intimate, but keep in mind what happens with protagonist Jess. She struggles to shoot Greg and even hesitates when facing herself, but when it comes time to shoot Downey and Sally, there is no such hesitation. Another thing to keep in mind is that the other Jess has reached stage 3 and knows that the deaths of the group are necessary to get back to her son, because she even remarks after killing Downey, "I'm sorry, but I love my son," before leaving. Given the fact that she couldn't approach them with a gun, given that protagonist Jess gave hers to them for protection, she had to relinquish everything save concealable weapons. So using the knife was born out of necessity, not desire. The death of the other Jess makes even more sense given the fact that protagonist Jess likely would have died from the axe swing had she not dodged out of the way. So the death of the other Jess could be perceived as just the result of different circumstances. In truth, there's virtually no end to the different interpretations one could have regarding what happens on the ship alone. Between not seeing all the events transpiring from different perspectives, the supernatural elements acting as potential stand-ins for things we might want more rational explanations for, and lacking any audio commentary or statements made from the writer-director, that I'm aware of, at least, perhaps will be exclusively left to theories like these. A couple of other interesting details include a poster shown a few times relating to the ALS's theater, which has figures that seem to be exclusively associated with tragedy, which is a fitting aesthetic given that it's where both Jesses ended up shooting Greg and the rest of the group there. The other detail concerns the ballroom. If you look at the instruments in the background, the bass drum has a letter A, with the right half extending down to the letter O to the right of it, which is presumably meant to refer to the ship, the Aeolus. However, in the sequence when Jess is driving with her son and the seagull is hit by the car, a high school marching band can be seen practicing in the background. And during the aftermath of the car crash, when people flock to the side of it and the camera pans across, it shows one of the students' drums, which has the exact same symbol on it. According to user Mao Joe of YouTube, quote, "The band is playing the very song from the broken record she finds on board of the Aeolus." This would be an awesome detail, but I personally can't hear a resemblance. Whew. Well, now that that's done, there's just one last final thing to talk about. Seagulls. I'm actually not kidding this time. I only delayed talking about it because I wanted to get to the other stuff first. The reason I began to take note of seagulls is that there are tons of instances throughout the film where they're seen and or heard. Granted, we're talking about a movie that has the characters going out to sea, but trust me, there's reason to contemplate the significance. For one thing, I counted well over a dozen instances when seagulls can either be seen or heard throughout the movie. Skipping past the innocuous times, one of the first points in the movie where the camera actively focuses on a seagull is the moment when Jess first boards the triangle boat, which incidentally is the same shot used at the very end of the movie that seems to signify the loop beginning anew, even though it doesn't truly start until she falls asleep on the quote-unquote yacht. Later on, gulls can be seen pecking at bodies of various Sally corpses, as well as a body that was tossed overboard from the Aeolus. Then, near the end, when Jess returns to her home, we get yet another instance where something can only be seen during this sequence, wherein shots of the hallway reveal that there's a painting of, you guessed it, seagulls. However, one of, if not the most significant points where they appear in the film comes at the 10-minute mark. In this moment, Jess has just gotten up from below deck after having her memories of the past written off as a bad dream. She then looks up at the sky to see a seagull flying overhead. Greg makes an innocuous comment about it thinking that the group is on a fishing boat. Nothing about the dialogue in the moments preceding, during, or after witnessing the seagull seem to warrant what occurs. Look carefully at her expression as she looks down after seeing the seagull. She may not be distressed, but seeing the seagull clearly has some kind of effect on her. Be it a reminder of her bad dream, an ominous feeling, or bad memory, we can't say for certain, but it does seem to affect her nonetheless. Sometimes filmmakers use little moments like these as a sort of mental palate cleanser, a way to shift topics of conversation, events, character interactions, etc., from one tone or theme to another. However, there doesn't seem to be any real reason for it other than to show the audience Jess's reaction to it. It's the one time in the movie that it's actively calling attention to the presence of seagulls that can be seen many times in the film, which begs the question, do they mean anything? Well, in terms of symbolism within the movie itself, once on the ship, the only times seagulls are seen are in relation to the scavenging of dead bodies. Therefore, like with crows and ravens, they could be seen as harbingers of death. From what I looked into online, seagulls are associated with a Greek goddess by the name of Leucothea, not really sure how to pronounce that, who used to be a mortal woman named Ino, or Ino. Not sure about that one either. According to legend, she and or her husband were stricken with madness by Hera for caring for Dionysus. It's worth noting that there are conflicting written accounts of the myth where one or the other was being driven more insane. The important thing to note is that in one of the versions, it relates to Ino, or Ino, being driven more mad and ends up killing one of her sons. In both versions of the story, however, she ends up leaping off a cliff into the sea with her younger son, Melicertes. Not really sure about the pronunciation of that. Whose body was found by his uncle, who, according to Encyclopedia Britannica, was none other than Sisyphus. Once again, reinforcing the popular theory regarding Jess breaking a promise with death. Okay, well, I am finally finished. This is among my first videos ever made and uploaded, so I apologize if there are issues regarding audio and or video and or the extent to which my voice might grate on you. I was thinking about making some more, but I'm going to be looking at what little media I currently possess, as I need to work on projects that I'm most interested in, so that I can be as focused as possible. Also noteworthy is the fact that this whole video concept was born out of what I saw on Ryan Hollinger's channel. So if you like this video and want to see more, I'd recommend looking into his channel, as this is a very experimental sort of thing for me, and far from something that I have any kind of schedule laid out for. So if you want more regular videos, I'd recommend looking into Ryan Hollinger's channel. Foundflix is also a good one. And if you're interested in the more in-depth character analysis for video game characters, I'd also look into King J. Grimm's channel and his In the Mind Of series. Last up, leave a comment. Is there something about the video that you didn't like? Do you have your own theory about what the movie's about? Symbolism? All that jazz? Let me know.